If you're going to go out and get merry this Christmas, you're going to have to take someone who doesn't. This person will be your lifesaver, because at the end of the night, they'll drive you home. But remember to pick your lifesaver before you go out and help them to stay sober all night. Because if they don't, they'll be drunk drivers. I wouldn't want to be in their shoes.
In association with the Beer, Wine and Spirits Council of New Zealand.
We are the blokes from down on the farm, we really know our cheese. There's much better value in Chesdale, it never fails to please. Chesdale slices thinly, never crumbles, there's no waste. And boy, it's got a mighty taste. Chesdale cheese, its finest cheddar, made better.
It's Good Night from Channel 2.
Yeah, but if you turn away from it, let's say I didn't need to do it. You can't have lost me, you can't have torn yourself. You just dog on the leash. No, it's no speed. Good day. You working, Joe? Hey, waving. That's Monday, Tuesday. Oh. You happy? Shoot over Tuesday, take a sickie.
Let's run with the horse of the devil!
No money. Give it back.
Oh, there's a frog in the grog. He's gone. And so's my drink.
You man, you thieving but
Oh.
What is that thing?
He's back. Whiskey.
Money first. All right. it have.
A helicopter flies an unusual mission on New Zealand's west coast. It's on contract to Timberland's west coast, taking out remnants of Rimu forests logged earlier by traditional destructive methods. After 200 years of indigenous logging, the old clear-felling methods severely reduced the extent of these precious forests. From 1994, the heli-harvesting operation takes out native trees that have been individually selected. Every tree is carefully picked and, helped by replanting, the operation's an example of how sustainable forest management can ensure these forests survive in perpetuity. On the Coromandel Peninsula, where some of the first native trees were felled by Europeans, logs are extracted the old way by the Driving Creek Railway. This line was built from the 1970s to bring specially grown pine down the hill to fire the kilns at Barry Brickell's Driving Creek potteries. Running through replanted native bush and traversing viaducts, tunnels, tight curves and steep grades, it's New Zealand's last working bush tram. The felling of the native forests was one of the great sagas of New Zealand's history, and it was right here in Coromandel Harbour in 1795 that a British Admiralty ship dropped anchor in search of Kauri. In that same year, the brig Fancy took on a cargo of kaikatea for export. As she sailed past these islands, 200 years of history was beginning. In the decades that were to follow, there were few corners of the New Zealand wilderness that didn't echo to the efforts of the bushmen and to the bush tramways, the complex rail networks which hauled out the logs. As well as tramways, logs were also transported by torrents of water released from driving dams. Driving Creek Railway is named after a driving dam that brought logs from these hills nearly 2 centuries ago. The early European artists were quick to recognize the beauty of this lush forest, but their depiction of an elegant and serene world also included a premonition of the wholesale plundering of these forests which was soon to follow. With the loss of her American colonies, Britain came to Northland and Coromandel for supplies of marine timber. Here, the forest grew literally down to the sea, Kauri and Kauri that were ideal as masts and spars for ships of the Royal Navy, holding power at sea during the Napoleonic Wars. It's a little-known fact that New Zealand timbers were used in ships of the line that fought in the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. To fell a kauri, which could be 8 feet in diameter, men had to be supremely fit. And for many years, apart from driving dams, the only forces used in the forest were men, horses, and bullocks.
Sing a song of a bullock team, long before the coming of steam. Cunning old Spider and Prince are there, yoked in the lead of the 14 pair, and the sniped log rolls on the sidling bear, while the bullocky lifts his voice in prayer.
Near the end of the 19th century, the logging of kauri accelerated until these magnificent trees were almost extinct. In 1840, with European settlement, and as more coastal timber was cut out, timber millers looked to other forests on the west coast, the King Country and Southland. Here grew trees that would sustain the development of a new nation. Matai, tawa, silver pine and beech, Totara for posts and high-grade joinery, Kahikatea for butter boxes and tallow casks, and forests of Rimu for everything from fine furniture to stately villas. All these forests would serve for 100 years. Today, there's very little left of most of the timber mills and the tramways that opened up thousands of hectares of New Zealand wilderness. The remains are gradually being taken back by nature. Some fragile remains will soon disappear forever. In the rainforest near Mitchell's on the west coast, moss-covered wooden rails are still faintly discernible on the forest floor, all that remains of a horse-drawn wooden tramway. Laid hastily, like many others, it probably operated for only a few months. 90 years later, it's a fascinating archaeological find. Although there are quite a few rusting relics from recent times, few written records survive from the early days.
My son William and his wife and family are doing well. William has set up a timber mill and has built himself a fine homestead using his own timber. 3 of his daughters help in the mill, where poor Annie lost 3 fingers at the saw bench. But she is a girl of great spirit and has recovered well.
This frontier industry evolved its own specialist technology. Along with the locomotives built by Heisler and Shea, the American Climax was a perfect design for a bush tram. Two inclined pistons transmitted power to square line shafts, then via universal couplings to 2-geared 4-wheel trucks. Every way you looked at it, the climax appeared and behaved as if it belonged right up at the frontier of the New World. Like all bush Lokis, the climax was flat out at 10 miles an hour. Heisler, Mallet and Climax were the aristocrats of bush tramway locomotives and were the pinnacle of a wide range of motive power that worked in the forest. The very first transport to use rails is lost in the mists of time and probably ran many years before Nelson's well-known Dun Mountain Tram, which began operations in 1862. Horses continued to play an important role in the bush after being supplanted by steam locomotives. The first, a vertical boiler chaplain, was used by Brownlees in Marlborough in 1870. Obsolete New Zealand Railways engines from the Vogel era were popular with timber millers because they were lightweight, like the tiny A, the short wheelbased D, and the F. From America, the Climax offered a wide range of horizontal B models, up to the most powerful, which could haul nearly 4,000 tons. Also burning either wood or coal, the upright Climax A, ideal on wooden rails. The powerful Heisler. And especially imported by the Totara Timber Company for its 52-mile line to Mokai, the very first American logging Mallet ever built. On the home front, Johnstons of Invercargill produced the diminutive Johnston A, which was very reliable and ran in the bush for years. 16-wheelers were built by Johnstons and by A&G Price at Thames, who produced 20 engines of various kinds between 1884 and 1943. On the West Coast, several eccentric and innovative machines were put together using spare parts by Davidsons of Hokitika. Dispatch Engineering in Greymouth built all their Lokis from the ground up. Improvisation evolved its own quirky creations. Any form of engine power was set to work in the bush. As late as 1982, a wooden rail tram carrying silver pine fence posts operated for a short time in Saltwater State Forest near Okarito on the west coast. Running for about 400 meters, second-grade Rimu rails were laid on Kamahi sleepers. All up, the track work cost $80, and it was the cheapest and best way to transport timber over swampy ground. Apart from the Ford Prefect engine that provided the power, this was the last operating example of a wooden track tram in the tradition that went back over 100 years. Tramways could carry almost anything, almost anywhere. On the Billy Goat in the Kauronga Valley, logs were lowered on rails down a 1-in-3 incline. Where possible, tram lines followed the natural contours of the land, and where bridges were built, they met minimum engineering requirements. These structures were usually abandoned when the area had been milled. company with cutting rights on a forest first had to construct a tramway. From the main line, short branches would be laid into the forest. Eventually, by the time an entire forest had been felled, the same light lengths of track might be laid and relayed several times. Some parts of the tramway systems became virtual main lines, lasting several years, a long time in the bush. Setting up a long-term operation in the forest, the tram line would be laid up to a tree that had been singled out and prepared to perform a specific job. The operation revealed the many skills required of men in the bush. In this ritual of the forest, the chosen tree, already trimmed and topped, was now secured by wires to the ground to begin its final living function as a spar tree. With the arrival of the steam log hauler between two bush lokies, the last major piece of equipment was on site. Within a day, logging could begin. Using the hauler in conjunction with the spar tree, logs could be dragged from the bush to the nearest railhead to be lifted and loaded onto the tram. The Brownlees of Ruru and Bell Hill had tramways 25 miles long. Where possible, trams were laid so a loki would never have to pull its load uphill. Before shifting to the west coast in 1915, the Brownlees milled the Pelorus district in Marlborough, where they arrived in 1864, a family dynasty that would eventually bridge 125 years of logging in New Zealand.
Nearly all the mills they had in the Sounds were all bullock power, and the old local always reckoned they were the best thing of the lot. They've got two begging for pulling logs and fattening them up and selling to the butcher.
In the 1880s, bullocks were gradually supplanted by steam haulers, which could pull logs out of the roughest of country. This kind of operation was always hazardous, and there was no substitute for manpower if anything went wrong. Injuries were always likely, and with the log haulers came a code of whistle signals.
The day I started driving the hauler, the bush boss told me, if you hear 5 whistles, grab the stretcher and the medical kit and run like hell. If you hear 6 whistles, you can take your time because he'll be dead.
The Washington log hauler was a rare import from North America. Inland from Gladstone on the west coast, Ogilvy's operated an extensive network of tramways and owned several log haulers, which were always a compelling sight to watch in action. Like tramway lokies, probably because they were cheaper to manufacture, many log haulers were built in New Zealand by companies like Cables, Judd, Price, Anchor Andersons, Johnstons and Dispatch. The last steam log hauler came out as late as 1951, and the fitful, erratic noises they produced over the years were part of the ambience of the forest frontier. Ignoring the risks around hauler sites, men often rode logs to balance them, and nobody wore hard hats. Felling a giant Rimu in Southland. Following scarfing by axe, 8-foot drag-tooth cross-cut saws were used on the bigger trees. This was tough work, and a team could come to blows if one man wasn't pulling the saw.
Sing a song of a Rimu drag, dropping a tree on a mountain crag. The pigeons fly in the matai trees, and the sound of the axe comes down the breeze, chipping the scarfs and the snipes and dees, and the headlogs fall in a hive of bees.
Bushmen took pride in their ability with the axe and cross-cut saw.
Good going with a tree. You could cut 4 of them down in a day, big trees.
Well, it was a craft because, I mean, you get likes of old Joe Anderson, and we became the same after years of it. You could look at a tree, stand alongside, look at it, and you knew exactly where it was going to go, and you knew exactly what to do to get it there.
Sometimes a bushman would suffer the consequence of his actions.
Get in there and fall the tree, and wetters would be all around you, crawl up your legs, and you'd have to, oh boy, and if they got nasty, they would dig their pincers into you.
Be it wetters and wild bees, fiddling a felled tree, sniping a chamfer ready for hauling away, or cutting a D, every act contained a high element of risk. Falling rocks and trees, a snaking rope or slipping axe caused permanent injuries like scarred shins, crushed feet, missing fingers and eyes. But it's hard to know who ever had it easier in these times, the men or the women.
Yes, well, the women, I think they worked the hardest. It was all very fine for the men to get up and go away to work in the morning and leave the women. Everybody had big families those days.
She was one of those sort of women that you just read about. She got up very early in the morning and she had clean clothes for the men, and she would put their underpants inside their pants and their socks on the end of the underpants and their singlets inside their jerseys. She would take a cigarette out to them, put it in their mouths, light their cigarette, and when they were ready, she'd take them a cuppa, and when they were ready, they just got out and pulled their togs on and went off to work.
They were tough. They worked in all kinds of weathers and, you know, up to their knees or that in mud, and they'd be wet all day. There's no such thing as wet time. They'd come home soaked.
My husband would come home to me and he'd say, "That's the wettest day I have ever experienced." And the next day he'd come home, he said, "The weather made a liar out of me yesterday. It was wetter today, Nan." And they would be wet and cold.
My husband was a heavy smoker, and I used to roll a packet of tobacco a day for him because it was too wet to roll it in the bush.
Sing a song of a snug hotel. We'll give the mill and the bush a spell. But Sunday night on the homeward trek, the track is crook and you'll break your neck. The spree is finished and so's the check.
Alcohol was prohibited in the bush. In the early years, men worked 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, with an hour for lunch and no tea breaks. Single men dominated the hundreds of bush camps that sprung up around the country, and the only women were cooks and the wives of a few married men.
We live in rich native bush of indescribable beauty, and it's a strange irony that the only purpose of our being here is to fell as many of these magnificent trees as the horses and tram are capable of hauling away.
Of all the humble dwellings hacked out of the bush, the shanty took pride of place. Here, single men ate and slept, and in the evening played cards after a big dinner prepared by a hard-working cook. And dreamt of wild weekends away in town.
And there was no road to Rimu in those days, and Bell Hill, if they wanted to have a beer, they'd take the trolley down to Rimu and go to Moana and roll a hogshead along the railway line. Take it to Bell Hill. In those days, there used to be all hops in the thing. Get it up there, there'd be more froth than beer.
From Taranaki to the Catlins, the bush tram also played a social role for townspeople curious to take a look at the forest interior, and these journeys often started on a similar conveyance in town. Trams carried all supplies for people in the bush, and in this hard-working world with its informal safety standards, there were many incidents that never made the history books.
Now, our line in Marlborough came very close to the Canvas Town pub as it went up the valley. And the old driver, they pulled up, they used to go there quite often, pull up and go up the pub and have a couple of beers. He'd been up the pub and the old loco was sitting on the tram waiting for him. And they came back. They never had any trucks with it. He was going down towards to Bell Hill from Carluke. And he had a Maori woman. I think it was a woman. There's been a lot of argument about this, but I think it was a Maori woman he had as a passenger. And while he was mucking around, just got the thing going, he was doing something, shoveling a bit of coal, and he slipped off the plate, fell off the damn thing, just got it moving, you know. So he yelled out to her to shut it off. And she thought he said, jump off. So she jumped off. And the bloody thing puffed all this way down, 3 miles, down to Blackball, and the mill was built in 2 big mills, and the line went through the settle, and they'd roll the logs to each mill. It puffed through there and down to the wharf and plonk over into the bloody Pelorus River. and they'd only just moved the sailing ship out. It would have gone clean through it.
The Loki was lifted from Pelorus Sound and was still steaming many years later. The New World was a resourceful frontier where almost nothing was ever considered a write-off. A high degree of maintenance was always necessary for some trams, which for many decades connected workings in the bush with the timber mill. These companies thought nothing of taking on major works, like replacing a collapsing hillside with a new trestle bridge. Other ventures lived with the risks. Sitting high on its truck, a Kauri log is gingerly lowered down a steep tram on the Coromandel. To guide progress round corners, a snubbing rope is used, but on occasions, all the care in the world couldn't outweigh the risk factor. In the age of indigenous logging and bush tramways, by acts of nature or the often hasty works of man, no one could know just what the next day could bring. In March 1956, Climax 1650 made a special run along Ellis and Burnand's bush tramway at Ongarui in the North Island's King Country. This spectacular line ran around a sheer rock bluff, through a long tunnel, and even had a spiral. Travelling on the train that day burned itself forever into the imagination of future potter young Barry Brickle.
And we did 23 miles behind that engine. When it was blasting along at about 6 miles an hour, it sounded like a JA doing 60 miles an hour because of the gearing effect. On the way up, they burnt coal in the loco, and on the way back, they burnt wood. There were some spectacular viaducts. The big Mangatuki was the most spectacular I'd ever seen in timber. It was actually a very sophisticated design of viaduct. It was no ordinary trestle. It was fully decked and handrailed in a grand sweeping curve over a magnificent tree fern gully. The native forest was largely intact. Around that area, a lot of Rimu and Matai and Kaikatia, very beautiful forest. Magnificent stuff that they didn't seem to touch for some reason.
December 1941, a busy day at Ongarui. At first light, with sawn timber loaded in wagons in the direction they travel, north or south along the main trunk line, Climax 1650 propels a shunt down to Ongarui railway station. With extra demands of the wartime manpower department for timber for army barracks, hospitals and refugee housing, this largest sawmill in New Zealand is stretched to the limit. "9 o'clock. With various supplies and a rake of empty bogies, 1650 sets off on the 20-mile journey to Camp 11. With the pushing through of the main trunk line, this tram was built to get at massive stands of Rimu and Totara in the backcountry, and the solid Mangatukutuku Viaduct, now 27 years old, is a perfect symbol of that resolute ambition. Taking water. On the way up the 9-mile hill, 1650's been burning coal, but the fireman, Rowley Home, takes on wood for the trip back down later in the afternoon. Lunchtime at Camp 11. In the preceding 15 years, sawmillers round the country like Ellis and Burnand have felt the pinch with import-export problems followed by the Great Depression. These years of the Second World War are seeing the last full-scale exploitation of the great indigenous forests of the Taupo region. From early morning, the Washington haulers been handling Rimu, Miro, Matai and Totara logs. At the skids in the forest beyond Camp 11, tram trucks are made ready for loading and will be replaced by empty bogies brought up by the Climax. Once the logs are rolled onto each pair of bogies, for safety, a gut chain will be connected beneath. As each log is loaded, the train is made up by one of two veteran Price 16-wheelers, Martha and Matilda. Living out an active retirement up here on bush branches, the old 16-wheeler now hands over to the climax for the run down to the mill, in a scene that in a few years will be only a memory. Today it takes a full 14 loads, and before departure, Martha's driver, Sid Chapman, obligingly oils around the climax, and perhaps dryly questions Alf Whiting how he feels having his life and his train in the hands of his fireman, now brakesman for the run home. With 120 tons of logs to control down the 1 in 30 hill, Rowley Home has needed to perfect his skills winding the brakes quickly. Any miscalculation, tightening down or easing the brakes could split the load or cause a runaway. Whether running alongside or riding on the logs, this was life on a knife edge. And over half a century later, Rowley Home can clearly recall this part of his working life.
Oh, I did slip once or twice, but as luck would have it, I was agile enough to get out of it quickly and had a quick reaction.
Sing a song of a long bush tram that's laid instead of a driving dam. And the Lokies long ousted the Bullockys team, through the bush, downhill and over the stream. The brakeman's a sweat as the slipping wheels scream, and the Loki breaks in a cloud of steam.
Today's journey is a far cry from Rowley's experience of riding logs, slimy with mud, down the 9-mile hill in the pitch dark on a stormy winter's night. Up to 7,000 feet of timber could be had from a good Totara tree. Growing to 60 feet without a branch, the longest log brought down on the tram today is over 40 feet. Like all others, it'll be cut into manageable lengths at the mill by Wade steam saws. A twin-cylinder Tangy steam engine powers the mill, driving everything from steam winches and breast bench to the huge drag saw which cuts the logs into flitches. In action, Ellis and Bonan's Ongarui Mill is an awesome sight and can be heard from a mile down the valley. With its steam technology, the Ongarui Mill can exceed any other in the country, although horses are still a vital part of its daily operations.
The horse joining up would, he'd come back slowly like this all the time, you know, and he'd feel a little bump. He'd stop, you see, and he'd listen, and he'd hear the pin drop in, and he'd look around at the driver, can I go now? And he'd say, yes, and away the horse would go, you know. You'd think they were human.
In preparation for tomorrow morning's shunt down to Ongarui railway station, the day ends as it began, with the product of all this endeavour, sawn timber. Right to the finish, the Ongarui Mill will hold to traditional methods, and before any sawn timber leaves on the shunt, it's been seasoned in filleted stacks in the open for a year. Sawmills, like this one in Southland, were a familiar part of the New Zealand scene. Many were run by small private companies, and as the timber industry was notorious for its ups and downs, a lot went broke. But at one time, there were over 300 mills that provided employment throughout the country for some 5,000 men.
One guy I know, and he didn't come back again, he reckoned he could hear the logs screaming for mercy when they went through the saws, you know? Yeah.
Of any place to work in, the sawmill was probably the most dangerous. Some old-timers said you could always pick a sawyer by shaking hands with him.
The old sawyers, it was very seldom you seen sawyers without one finger missing or something. When they were following the timber through the saw, they were pushing it up through the saw, a lot of them had a habit of putting their hand on the side, and I mean you do that every day for 6 days a week for 10 years and all of a sudden you get careless. But like your thumb and your forefinger was worth more than the rest of them. The Compensation Act those days, you more or less could go to the Compensation Act people and they would tell you what each one was worth.
Yet, for all the risks, often a boy starting work in the bush at 12 would end up an old man seeing out his life in a timber mill.
Sing a song of a sawmills crew. They curse the job and the cookhouse too. From the head of the twins to the firewood bloke, they toil and grumble and sweat and joke, while the boss walks around with the same old croak, keep up your tally or I'll go broke.
While the compensation people could calculate the dangers of a timber mill in hundreds of severed fingers, noise pollution continued to remain an unrecognised menace. On a remote Southland coast on the edge of Fiordland are the remains of one of New Zealand's most ambitious logging ventures. Established to cut out Rimu in the lowland rainforest, the enterprise operated for only 8 years before being abandoned at the onset of the Great Depression. The deaths of 2 young brothers, from whom it took its name, was a foreshadow of its own brief existence. The Port Craig mill was owned by the Marlborough Timber Company, and in its short time produced more timber than anywhere else in the country. Perched on a cliff overlooking the sea, the mill had 2 levels, with the benches and saws above powered by big sawdust-burning boilers below. All the timber was exported. The company employed 160 men, including a 14-year-old who, in 1926, joined up as a whistle boy on a log hauler crew. Minty Hughes was fascinated by the operation.
There was a conveyor that came from the mill with 3 big endless chains driven by the mill, and the timber came down onto the wharf by them, and they had hooks on the chains so the timber couldn't slip on the way down because there was quite a grade on it, really. And when it came to the wharf, they had where the tables where all the timber was sorted there and tallied and stacked into slings of timber, 1,500 super feet in a sling, ready for shipping.
Following silting problems in loading ships by lighter, a 60-foot tower was erected on the wharf, so packets of timber could be loaded by overhead cable. But the pride of Port Craig was the gargantuan Lidgerwood steam hauler. The Lidgerwood weighed a massive 90 tons. Towed by a Loki along short lines radiating off the main bush tram, the Lidgerwood, its 17-man crew and overhead skyline cable, engaged its own form of blitzkrieg and could reap logs over a mile sweep in the Rimu forest. The company eyed the huge potential of the podocarp forests that stretched many miles inland from the sea. In 1923, a survey was conducted for the Tramway.
In the solid bush, because it hadn't been touched except by our own slashers, My father had to select a route which conformed to the requirements of the subsequent tram builder.
Although it hasn't been used since 1928, the main route of the Port Craig tram is today a bush walkway. When it was being surveyed, the undergrowth disguised the terrain and made heavy going.
We'd come to one of these gulches and we'd mark the place with a pole and flag on it, and then we'd proceed to find a crossing, because some of them were anything up to 100 feet deep and the walls were perpendicular. So we had to find a deer track and follow the track till it crossed the gulch.
Like tram tracks, the structures which bore them were usually temporary affairs. On the pioneer frontier, even heavy viaducts which were made of logs soon rotted away. The Percy Burn Viaduct at Port Craig was none of these. Built from imported Australian hardwood and designed to bear anything the Lidgerwood could pull from the forest, the Percy Burn stands to this day.
The trestles in that, they made a template, something similar to a pattern for a woman's dress. It was made on the ground beside the bridge.
The largest wooden viaduct still standing in the world, the Percy Burn nearly succumbed to an arson attack. It's recently been restored and is New Zealand's grandest monument to the pioneering era in the forest wilderness. Although many logging operations were short-lived, the clearing of the forest was often a rapid process.
And never ever lost a day's work through the rain, ever. There was only one thing that ever stopped them working in the bush, and that was a high wind. Because the trees go anywhere, you know. They'd be scarfing a tree and the bloody wind pick it up, take it anywhere. But the whole scheme in the bush changed when power source came in.
Cut and fell in every direction, no one gave thought to this destruction. To feed the mill was a daily blessing. What happened soon requires no guessing. £1 for 100 feet board. Was the destruction worth the reward? Is the land richer? Am I the trump? A brittle, blackened, burnt-out stump.
By now, some bushmen had come to question the destruction and express their strange love and respect for the forests they'd felled.
It was the beauty of these birds in the trees and the tuis singing and on a lovely summer's day, you see the moss on the floor of the forest, just waves and waves of moss and other plants you wouldn't see before, only in the bush, and the sun coming through and showing like arrows of light, beams of light coming through in an open place in the bush, shining down like this. It was really fantastic, and I reckon that, you know, that the trees sighed when you went to fall them, you know, it'd be caused through a gentle breeze blowing way up on the tops of the trees, and the trees would go, you know. And then it was pitiful, really. If you fell a Miro and it was had 3 or 4 or 5 pigeons on it feeding, well, the birds would follow the tree down like that, you know. And it'd crash on the ground and throw the dust and the leaves would fly up, and the pigeons would fly away and circle around, and then they'd come down again and settle on the stream. But you could tell they were wondering, well, what made it fall over, you know?
In the mid-1950s, it was still possible to observe the final working remnants of the pioneering frontier. The rusting Lokies looking like battered knights in armour, worn out from a lifetime of tilting at trees in the forest. On the truncated tram of Smythe Brothers and Boyer at Naroma in October 1956, Climax 1317 still ran a shuttle over 2 miles between the mill and the skids. Two weeks later, the tram was pulled up for a road. Her exhaust steam rising up through the trees in her dying days, old 1317 recalled sights that had been legendary for over 80 years. With readily available supplies of radiata, which had first been hand-planted during the Great Depression, and the advent of new forest technology, the pioneering age was drawing to a close. In 1965, a Heisler, one of the last Lokies running, continued to shunt wagons between the mill and Ongarui railway station. One of the Heisler's last acts of haulage in service was probably one of its most significant, the removal of Climax's 1650 and 1203 for preservation. At first, the old engines seemed reluctant to leave the mill they'd served for so many years. This was a unique sight, watched by only a handful of people. Few might have realized it, but as the three engines moved across the high trestle, the act symbolized the end of one of the great sagas in New Zealand history.
We had a pride in how much we could do in the day, like pre-war I'm talking about now. You always wanted to get a drag tomorrow more than you got today, sort of stuff. And the conditions were shocking compared with what you see today. Mud to your hips some places.
I was in the situation where I did have to sluice my husband down. I'd have to get buckets of warm water and throw it over him out on the lawn. He would be so dirty.
By the time they'd done their day's work, they had enough pretty heavy work, just, cross-cut saws, none of these power saws in those days. We did it the hard way.
They just took what they were there to take, and there was nothing chopped for the fun of it. The only time they chopped for the fun of it was at the sports days when they had their chopping.
It was a hell of a place to get any vegetables, so everything had to come up our tram.
Oh, on the Loki, yes, the bread was unwrapped, just thrown into a sack. Wet morning, you'd get the fingerprints of the Loki driver on your bread. It was fairly rough, all right. The meat was just wrapped up and thrown into a sack, and sometimes the wet days the paper would break and the flies would get at the meat by the time we got home from work.
The bacon would be hung up in the ceiling of the kitchen of the pub, and there was a big meat safe outside. And of course the cook would go some mornings to get the meat for the men's breakfast, and it'd be gone. The men would be on the beer the night before, and they'd have cooked it all up themselves, so they'd be scratching for breakfast.
All you did, you sat down and ordered you wanted meat for 4. You never, I think all the time I was there, saw mutton. It was always beef. You reckon we couldn't afford mutton?
Making up all those lunches every day, yeah, it was an awful job. You know, you had to try and remember who liked this and who liked that, because if you gave somebody something that they didn't like, you would be likely to be wearing it after they came home from work. You know, some of them would throw it.
We had some great old dances every week. Bloggers would come in from Nelson Creek, walk through the bush. We had some hard cases then, we did. But they were good, all good, honest thieves.
Some of the sawmills down to 3 Mile, they'd go straight from the mill to the hotel, stop there till 10 o'clock at night drinking. Back there at 8 o'clock next morning, the sawyer would turn out his 10,000 feet a day.
Two centuries after the British Admiralty first took trees from here, visitors can ride the bush tram at Barry Brickle's Driving Creek Railway in Coromandel. There are dedicated timber museums at Putararoo and Matakoi, and at Hawera a reconstructed tram takes visitors on a ride into the past. At Shantytown, Climax 1203 steams along a genuine old tramway. It's one of the world's only 4 climaxes still steaming. The Browns Creek sawmill was moved to Shantytown, where it was restored and can be seen running. In Southland, a private steam mill was erected in the 1970s and cuts timber as a commercial business. In Southwestland, at the far end of Bruce Bay, there's a special place. Among fragile reminders of the tenuous hold of man, where a busy mill once provided sawn timber to coastal traders that called at this remote bay, is the last bush loki in the New Zealand wilderness. In 200 years, indigenous timber's been one of the foremost resources for a country moving to an agricultural and urban society. Heli harvesting has succeeded the bush lokis and rails of the past, and today's society is keenly aware of the global significance of these remaining indigenous forests. For water and habitat protection, recreation and their sheer beauty, their permanence is assured, to be used and enjoyed by future generations.
So you see, I didn't like falling the bush in the finish. I felt quite sad about it, but I knew it was my living. Others were doing it. If I knocked off doing it, someone else would take it up. So I felt sort of philosophical about the whole thing.